Do we know who Tab is?
There it is at the bottom. Tabitha Wentz, City of Fairfax.
Oh, okay.
CDBG Demolition Grant Workshop provided by the Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kim Millward. I am the Economic Development Planner for the Regional Council. With me this evening is Jerry Dearmont, our Executive Director, who helped put together the presentation we're doing this evening, as well as some staff that we had in the past that helped work on this, Linda Latteroot several years ago. And then Amy Dallas will be joining us also this evening, who is running our technology. She is our regional planner and will be helping me with fielding questions. So this workshop really came out of the fact that we have lots of towns.
Kim, we can't hear you.
That look like this. Or maybe you have commercial structures in your community that look like this. Or even you may have some structures in your community that look like this, that are recently vacant, dilapidated, don't have boards on their windows. Not only are they an eyesore, but they're also a safety concern in your community. And so communities have been asking Jerry and I what they could do. And one of the things we talk to communities about is applying for a community development block grant, demolition grant. Well, one of the things is that people automatically think that maybe just because they're going to get grant money, it's going to cover all the cost. And that's not the case. But the other part is to have a successful grant application to get that money so that you can defray a large portion of the cost related to taking down those structures. There's a lot of prep work that goes into that. And so that's really what this workshop is about this evening, is the prep work that communities can do ahead of time so that they can create that community plan and have a successful CDBG demolition grant application. So with that, we will move on. So the first part of this is really preparation and preparing your community plan. And so we've kind of outlined several steps. So with CDBG, typically you're allowed to have one open grant per category and then one grant that is open on behalf of. So if your community already has an open grant project with community development block grant, or is in the preparation of doing one for, let's say, a water or a wastewater treatment system, it's okay to go ahead and still continue to attend this session because there's a lot of prep work that goes into doing a demolition grant and some things that you can be working on between now and then while you're working on your current project and getting ready to close it out. So first thing you need to do as a community is establish a dangerous building policy. And we can send you samples of those. And then you're going to take that policy and you're going to write it into enforceable ordinances. So again, we can send you samples of that, but we highly recommend that you talk to your city attorneys for the language and guidance as to how to go about writing those ordinances. Because those ordinances you're going to turn around and you're going to provide code enforcement on. So those ordinances could be some of the things that you are already starting on, not only the dangerous building codes, but making sure that properties are kept nicely in your community. And so we want to make sure that as you're writing those, that they are enforceable, because you're going to maybe need to have to enforce those as part of your CDBG project to help get ready for that. And then you want to make sure that as you're writing those codes, that you provide some kind of law enforcement support in there. So you want to talk to, if you have city police, your local sheriff's department, maybe if you have a building code inspector, things like that, that you want to talk to those individuals and see how you can go about enforcing those city codes as you're writing them. And then you want to publicize everything that you're doing with all of this within your council meetings, and maybe even have some open meetings or town hall meetings with your community so that they are aware of what's going on and they're not caught off guard. So that's kind of the next step. Then is to establish a fund for demolition with demolition goals for your community. So whether you go for a CDBG grant or any other kind of funding, or you decide as a community to go about this effort on your own, you're going to have some kind of funds set aside for inspections, for demolition, for cleanup of those properties. And so beginning to establish a fund early on is a good way in which you can start setting aside that money and talking about your goals as a community and what areas of town you might wish to clean up or which properties you might wish to demolish. Then you want to try to identify those property owners of those properties that you feel like maybe need to come down in your community, and try to work with them and establish that rapport, because one of the things you're going to need is their buy-in to help clean up that property, demolish it as we move on in this grant process. The next thing you can do is, and we highly suggest, is that you create a map of your community that shows all your dilapidated structures. And that's everything from housing to commercial buildings. So those structures, when you identify them, can be buildings that are currently occupied, whether they're residential or commercial, or they can be vacant. But we want to document all of those so that we have an idea of what your community looks like in terms of those types of structures. Then we want to start documenting all the problems that are with each of those properties. So do we know that they're vacant? Do we know that we maybe have walls in a commercial structure that are unstable, roofs that are unstable, broken out windows? Are they of an age where maybe they have lead paint or asbestos or boilers in them? And some of that you may not know. And so the council has some resources that we can work with other agencies, such as the Department of Natural Resources, to have either a survey done of some properties in your community, some phase 1 assessments, which are really looking at the history of that property, or phase 2, where potentially they have some testing that they can do on that property to determine what materials are in that building and what kind of safety measures we might have to do when we go to take that structure down. All of that, some of that has to have property owner buy-in, especially if we're going to look at a phase 1 or phase 2. A survey by the Department of Natural Resources of your communities to potentially identify problems with properties such as brownfields. And what brownfields are really are just properties that need to be taken care of and potentially have some kind of hazards with them. Then that they can do actually from just a survey from the street, and they don't necessarily need the property owner's permission. But as we get in further to the process, we will need that. But we definitely want to document those problems as we can go through this process. The next thing is you want to start then to put all that information into a community plan, kind of a strategic plan. And once you've done that, now you're ready to kind of start that process of completing a CDBG application, as long as you have no other projects in line for that funding source, or you're not in the process of currently doing one of those, such as a water project or a wastewater project that is using their funding. The other potential that we have, as we mentioned earlier, is that there is possibility of a nonprofit. So if you have a nonprofit in your community who is potentially a community betterment organization who has already taken on these types of tasks, it may be something that you could apply on the behalf of them. And we would have to sit down and talk about that. But that is another potential option for your community. So CDBG requirements are pretty specific for a demolition grant. The national objective that we're going to use is elimination of slum and blight. And so that basically means we're going to be taking down those less desirable areas in your community and trying to redevelop those, or at least leave the land vacant and in a nice kept, well-kept state. The next part of that is we're going to take a list of all those properties and we're going to submit those to the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that none of them are eligible to be on the historic register, and if so, work through that process, or to make sure that we're not going to find potentially any historic artifacts that we might damage in the process of taking down that home or that commercial structure. So we're going to start that process early on at the grant application stage so that we have plenty of time to work through all that. And that requires us taking photos of the property from different angles, and potentially even if it's safe inside a particular structure. So we want to start that early, and we want to take color photos and make sure that we are doing a really good job of describing the area and what we plan to do. So the next thing is with CDBG, it's kind of an extension of that SHPO process, is we want to start also the environmental review process, because we want to make sure that we're not going to do anything that potentially could put debris in the water stream or affect your wastewater system, affect the air quality, and a bunch of other factors. But we are going to start that process as well. And then we need to come up with a really good budget. So not only do we have to look at what it's going to cost to take down those structures and clean up those structures, we have to make sure that we have costs related to the beginning parts of that process. So inspecting the structures, determining if we need to have any kind of other administrative costs to do this grant. We want to make sure that we include in there. And that also could include potentially some of the environmental review costs. It could include potentially some other costs, such as unhooking some things like water or sewer, potentially maybe. And then we need to do a public needs assessment. We always have to do a public hearing with the CDBG grant, and we can do those up to a period of time before we file the application. But we also need to make sure that we are demonstrating that the project we are currently applying for funding for is one of the top priorities in the community. And so that is a short process that we go through during the public hearing to make sure that everyone is on board with the project, but also to make sure that it is one of the top needs of the community to take down those particular structures. Are there any questions before we go on to section 2? Or Jerry, anything you want to add?
I think you're doing good so far, Kim. Keep it up.
Marcus has a question. He's
Yep.
raising.
Hearing
I have a
none, we
couple,
will move on to section 2.
Kim,
So
these are
Kim.
the CDB, part of the CDBG requirements for
Kim.
the grant. One of the things we need to do is, earlier we mentioned you wanted to
Kim.
start mapping
Kim.
those particular
Kim.
structures within the community. And we need to put together
Why
a
can't Kim
really
hear
good
us?
detailed
I don't
map
know.
to include in our application
Kim,
for CDBG.
I'm texting.
And we want that
Okay.
to not only
Thank you,
show the
Marcus.
streets, but we want to also set up a coding system so that we can show all the dilapidated structures in the community, those that are housing, those that are commercial, those that are occupied, as well as vacant. And as you can see, this sample here shows 6 potential houses that were marked for demolition as part of this project. And we also, on the map, numbered those where they're located so that they were easy to find. And there is a coding system that is recommended by CDBG as part of that process. And our office can help you put together this detailed of a map.
Kim, can,
So this is one of the other forms that we have to do. One of the things that makes a good, strong CDBG application is that we want to show that we're going to have an impact on the amount of structures that you have in your community that is dilapidated. And that we're actually having a significant impact. And what they're looking for is about an 80% impact of the structures that you have that are dilapidated and vacant. Are we getting close to 80% with this grant of taking those particular structures down? And in CDBG, you can do a housing only grant, a commercial only grant, or a combination grant.
Kim,
So this is just one of the forms we fill out, and this shows you some of the coding that we have. So if it's a residential structure, we're going to code it as a D. Unless it is a dilapidated and vacant structure, then it's going to be coded DX. And then we have commercial structures and non-residential structures are coded as ZX. And then the number of vacant, dilapidated commercial and non-residential structures is labeled DZX. And so we're going to kind of tally all of those up, as well as the total costs, and create an average cost per unit for the grant. Some of the other things that we have to do for the CDBG demolition grant are we have to show proof of ownership. So we have to show that either the city owns that particular property, or the individual or business, that property, commercial or residential, who it is actually owned by. And that person has to give signed consent as part of that process. We will also be looking at having individuals contribute to part of the cost of tearing down those structures. So for residential structures, it is $1,000 per structure. Typically, some communities will pay $500 of that cost, and then the residential or homeowner will pay the additional $500. For commercial structures, unless they're owned by the city, it is 20% of the cost of demolition. And so as we're going through all this, this is a good reason why it's good to identify those property owners early, because some of these property owners of structures you may want to take down may not live in your community anymore. They may have bought the property and moved away, or maybe bought it as what they thought was going to be an investment property, or a rental property. And so it may take some time to track those individuals down and talk to them about their property and gain their trust so that you can get the consent you need to have that structure as part of this grant. When they sign off on their consent, they're going to sign off on their consent. They understand that as part of this grant that they're going to have that structure removed, but that they get to retain the rights to the property. And they're also going to consent or pledge to pay their portion of the costs associated with that. We're then again going to make sure we take colored pictures of each property. And for properties to be part of the grant and part of the demolition process, we have to verify using utility records that those properties have been vacant or unoccupied for 12 months or 1 year. Are there any further questions or any questions? Or Jerry, do you have anything you want to add?
I wanted to add on when we was talking about dilapidated structures, what they consider dilapidated is when it requires $15,000 or more to repair those structures.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat.
Oh my
but
gosh,
Marcus, you
Kim.
indicated you had a question and you would ask me later. So drop it in the chat and I will go back and answer it.
Kim, can you hear me? Kim?
So part of the grant application is always a narrative. And so those questions are the next section we're going to talk about. And they really explain and give great detail to the review team at Community Development Block Grant, what you're trying to do. And so we want to be able to give them a description of the buildings that you're wanting to demolish, as well as a history of any violations you have. So that's another good reason that if you already don't have your dangerous building policy, your ordinances, and your enforcement in place, to go ahead and work on that now, so that you can build that violation history for those properties, and help explain part of that impact that it's going to have for your community to be able to demolish that structure. Again, as I mentioned earlier, CDBG recommends that 80% of the, so if you're doing housing only, let's say, and if you had 10 buildings that were vacant and needed to be demolished, that for an application to go forward, or to be a strong application, that you had 8 of those buildings and building owners who were willing to have those buildings demolished to equal that 80% ratio. So they also want to see what the city's long-term demolition plan is. And so if you don't have that, that is why we are doing this today, is so that those first 9 steps you can take and roll up into your community's demolition plan. And then you can start working on your fund to help take down those structures. Then we also have to have the cost estimates for demolition. And we're going to check each structure for asbestos, but also lead paint, and potentially any other hazards, so that once those are going to be demolished, we know how to properly take care of that paint, because asbestos and lead paint have to be removed in special ways by trained contractors. So we want to make sure that we're doing that and identifying that, so that we have the accurate cost. Because if we don't have the accurate cost with those 2 things in particular, you could underestimate your costs for your project. And then we're going to talk about project readiness. So as part of this, we're going to need to have inspections, and we're going to need to have contractors who are able to, are licensed to do asbestos and land paint removal and take down structures. We're also going to have potentially cleanup crews and waste haulers that we need to have as part of this project. And so you just can't use necessarily whoever is in your community. With Community Development Block Grant, you have to procure those services, which means you have to put together kind of some project specs of what you're going to need, and then you put that out for bid. And then you make sure that those individuals are qualified to do that work. And then you look at the cost estimates that we're going to have to do that work. And then we select those professionals. So we're going to want to do that ahead of time as part of the application process as much as we can, and create that list of professionals who are going to be required for us to have a successful project. We're also going to do, give them a history of demolition activities over the last 2 years that your community has undertaken on its own, or with other grants. If you haven't, that's okay. We have to have a place to start, but that is what they recommend, is that we tell them about what you guys have tried to do over the last 2 years. And then we want to make sure we have all those cash, match, and commitments, and documentation of who owns those properties, from the owners and or the city, depending on who owns those particular properties. Timeline is a must. Most CDBG projects have to be done and completed within 24 months. So we want to make sure that we have a good timeline to make sure that we can get everything we need to get done and close out our grant by that time. Being on time with a CDBG grant will also help you with other applications in the future, as they know that you can successfully manage a project. and complete a project with them. And then we're going to look at other efforts to leverage funds. So that could be using the Department of Natural Resources to do those phase 1 and phase 2 assessments. Potentially, there is some cleanup money available too through grants if that there are hazardous substances found that could help reduce the portion that CDBG might need to pay, or at least allow you maybe to do a few additional homes in the process. Then we also have to describe the public interest and what is your community's interest in having those homes taken down. Are you, or commercial structures, are you in the process of redeveloping your downtown and those structures are not only unsafe, but open up property where you could redevelop and placing new commercial structure? Is it a house that if you take down is a possibility that you could plan some possible recreation there? Or is it that maybe you need some infill housing or some new housing in your community? And those are just some of the samples. Okay, well, let me try that. Okay, Amy or Jerry, do you have anything you want to add?
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. Your phone has several text messages.
Well, I've tried looking at it and I haven't seen them. So go ahead. What did you guys have that you wanted to add?
Well, I think, no, Jerry may have finished with hers. She was talking, your
Okay.
last break that you took. I don't know if you were finished, Jerry, about dilapidated, that dollar amount that you gave.
Yes, I was
Okay.
finished on that. And then I went ahead and answered Laverne's question. I'm
Thanks.
assuming he's okay with that. But yes, vacant for 1 year, and it has to be verified by the utility company that it's been disconnected for at least 1 year or more.
Sorry, no, I couldn't hear you guys at all. Kind of sad. So,
Okay, here's another question. Is there any way around the consent from the property owner? Various violations of code, no attempt to rectify, or they cannot be reached?
not that I am aware of. Jerry, you
No.
aware of any?
Not that I'm aware of, Tabitha.
I was trying to
So-
think what Jerry or Jean had done over in Worth County a couple times, and I think that was maybe the property had come up for tax sale and the city had bought it or
Mhm.
somebody else had bought it who then wanted to do the project.
Yeah, we have to have their consent, so I don't know how else to do that. Maybe through the county court.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're not paying, are they paying their taxes and stuff on it? I mean,
So I did check in on that because there was a couple properties that were coming up on a tax sale last week.
uh-huh,
To just buy them really cheap to cover the taxes. Then I found out you can't do anything on the property for at least 1 year because they still have the opportunity to come back.
Mm.
the
That's
opportunity
correct.
And pay the
Yes.
taxes and take over. So if you bought it with that purpose in mind, they could walk in there and buy it back and you wasted
Mhm.
wasted that effort. So
Is there a way that you could get the property owner to donate the property to the city?
I've heard of them selling for like $1, to the state.
Mhm.
I have heard of that process, but
Mhm.
We'll have to work, yeah, we'll have to work through that one. And you can always, of course, talk to your city attorney, who may have some different advice or different solutions for you to that.
Marcus, would you like to go ahead with your question now, or has it
Yeah,
already been answered?
if it's okay, I have a couple of
You're
them.
fun.
So regarding basically what we're talking about here, Kim and Amy and Jerry, is each community would need to have their own preliminary plans in place, like their dangerous building policy, all the things you mentioned there. Each
Yes.
community would have to have their own, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I know like in Holt County, I don't believe any of the towns have any code enforcements, anything in place regarding that. You know, safe housing, dilapidated structures. So that's what would have to be started first, correct? We'd have to get all those communities to start that process.
Yes, and I would say like if a community doesn't have their own
Mhm.
and they want to reach out to use Holt counties for some reason, maybe they could work some type of agreement out there between the city and the county.
If we develop one countywide, or
I would think that would work. I want to say Forest City might have their, I'm not sure. But I would think you could somehow work with the county and the county could be their code enforcer, to deliver those notices to their door and things like that.
yeah.
But we won't confirm on that, okay?
Okay, sure. And then the public needs assessment hearing. I had a question on that.
Okay,
So you would post that in the paper, or as you mentioned, through meetings, council meetings or whatever. And then what does that all include, a public needs assessment hearing? I just didn't quite understand that.
right. So the public hearing portion would be published in the newspaper, most likely. Some small communities, we might be able to just post it around town, but it's going to have to be in places that are highly frequented by your residents. So could be post office, courthouse, grocery store, places like that. And we would work through that part of the process with the Community Development Block Grant. So the public hearing is twofold. It lets people know that you're taking on a project that's going to request grant funds and kind of the details of the project. So it would talk about how much you're applying for, whether you're going to do residential and or commercial structures, and kind of your timeline for that project. Then as part of that, you're going to do a community needs assessment. So that really kind of looks at a variety of different areas within your community. There's questions on there related to emergency services. There's questions related to sidewalks, streets, water, sewer, schools, jobs, housing. And so the question would be like, how do you rate your, let's say, medical services in your community? Good, fair, poor, doesn't exist. And so it's just kind of a general consensus of the room of how you feel about that. And so the idea is that you would then identify needs that your community has suggested that you guys work on. And one of those we would hope would be a demolition project, and that it would be hopefully in the top 5. If it's not one of the top, we would prefer one of the top 2, but if it's not one of the top 2, if we can then explain why it's not one of the top 2, at least if it's in the top 5.
The needs assessment is a 2-page form that's included in the application. So we're just going through that to complete all the questions that are asked, and then we have to rank those. And then we get down to the bottom and we go back and look at it, and demolition should be one of your top 5. Yes. So it's just a form that's in the application that we have to go through during the public hearing.
Okay. Next question. I don't know all the names that's on. Do we have anybody from any of the towns in Holt County on the call? Any city folks or?
I don't believe so. No.
Okay. So my next question, and I'm just trying to think of how to get this process started. If we can't get each small community to maybe work on this themselves, could we do this on a county level could there be one person assigned, code enforcement or someone able to go in and do some of these inspections? Have you heard of that, or does it have to be each community doing their own?
I would say each community needs to work on their own. I mean,
Okay.
We're here to help them, that's for sure.
Okay.
We can, and actually we can provide possibly a street map for the communities. We may have those on our server where we've worked with cities in the past. Some of them may actually have the houses on those maps. But if the structure is no longer there, or they've built a new structure, we can, revise those maps. But as
So,
far as the ordinances and things that need to be passed up front, that's something that needs to be done. Working on the map,
okay.
that needs to be all done up front.
And the reason for my asking that is most of these towns do not have the funds available to hire a code enforcer. So
Right.
they probably won't even consider that. And then finding someone who has, the education and expertise to be able to do these inspections and, look at the electrical system and make that determination of a $50,000, repair or more.
Right. Right.
So with that being said, if these communities don't have that capability, is it something that one person could take care of several? That is kind of what
I see
would
what
say.
you're saying. I see what you're saying.
And the commissioners asked me that. And I'm not, and I've gone to a lot of OSHA training. I've got utility experience, and they've asked me if that's something I could do. Well,
Oh, okay.
I just didn't know how that would work with each community.
Well, for upfront, we just need some type of a cost estimate, because, then when we put that into the budget, you want the cost of the demolition to tear the structure down. We also have to have it checked for asbestos or even lead. But they have a set amount that CDBG will pay for that to do the inspections.
Okay.
But when it comes down to the application being awarded, then the communities actually have to hire a licensed asbestos or lead inspector
Right.
that's licensed through Department of Natural Resources.
Yes.
So I want to say it's like $700 or something like that for asbestos inspections.
Yes.
They allow that much in the application.
Yeah, and you're correct. I did that when I was at the hospital. We would have inspectors come in when we were doing a demolition project.
Yes.
Now we have in our communities, we have a lot of these structures that need to be demoed.
Correct.
That's a fact.
Yes.
And in talking to a lot of the mayors and different ones, city councils, and even a lot of the homeowners, they are all for cleaning up their community and getting rid of some of the bites and the slum look. But they'll come right out and say, I just don't have the money.
Right.
So they've been sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. So this would be a nice option to tell them, there is help, but it would still mean a commitment on their part, right? Yeah.
Marcus, do you guys in some of the bigger towns like Oregon or Mound City, do they require building permits?
They do not.
Okay.
They have no structure that way. And it was kind of shocking to me when I started there, and I saw some remodeling going on and different work. And I said, who's checking the electrical? Who's checking the HVAC? And
Right.
Nobody.
And the reason I wondered that is I was thinking more about, you guys have had a couple of buildings in Mound City that have partially fallen, and they've blocked them off. And so I didn't know if there was somebody who was enforcing the code, because I know I've seen it in the paper, the council talk about those structures. So
Yes.
that's why I was just trying to confirm and think of who.
And those old buildings in that downtown have asbestos. It's no doubt they have asbestos. I'm kind of the same way, but it's just a different, compared to Maryville and some of the other communities, it's just a whole different, ball game, if I can use that expression. The approach and how to go about it, how to get some of this corrected. So, but I mean, it's a starting point. Now, I did have one more question on the time frame. You said it takes about 2 years, or it can take 2 years.
That is the maximum time from the time your CDBG grant is awarded
It's
until
approved.
close.
So it's got to be demoed and cleaned up. Okay, so what if we start this process? When does this grant end? Is there an end on it, or?
So typically CDBG comes in different cycles. We're not sure when the next CDBG cycle will open up, but we've had so many communities asking us about demolition projects. And in looking at what has been required in the past, that's the reason Jerry and I wanted to do this workshop this evening. So we don't know for sure when it's going to open. You're going to have, once it does though, we'll only have probably about 60 days to put together an application. And then it'll have a deadline, and then CDBG will review those applications, score them, and then they will notify communities that are successful in obtaining great grant funds. And then from there, there's kind of a process of signing in a kind of like a new grantee meeting, right, Jerry?
Yes.
That they'll go through. And so they'll kind of talk about, and then that's kind of when their 24-month
Yeah.
clock will start to get
Once
the
the-
project done.
Yeah. Once the project is funded, they give you a date. I mean, it could be July 21st of 21, and it's 2 years from that date is when it has to be completed.
Okay.
So, and we typically see these same cycles, usually every year we'll see a round of demolition grants open. So if you don't make it in this cycle, probably a year from now, we'll see something very similar. And if they have funding left over, we have at times seen them open different categories open like mid-year.
But once the community would have all of these things in place, their policies or plans, then even if they don't get this round, it would be there for when it opens again. That's
Yes.
kind of what you're saying.
Correct. Yes.
So we need to start this process regardless with these communities.
It doesn't hurt at all to get started. Like we said, we don't know when the next cycle will open yet. So
Okay.
it may take some of these communities some time to get those ordinances in place, to get their maps established and that kind of thing. Have a demolition fund established, for that, and talk to all the property owners and commercial building owners.
Sounds good. I think that's all I was asking about. So.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Wait for the person who's been talking who forgot to unmute. Just a couple seconds to see if there's anybody.
I guess I did have one more question.
Okay, Marcus, go ahead.
Will these slides be available?
Yes, so sorry if I didn't mention that earlier. We're of course recording tonight's meeting, and then we will have handouts that we will send out to all the attendees, as well as Jerry and I are looking at kind of a small packet to put together that you can use. Okay,
because this would be very valuable to share with individuals. And then I did have one more question. I'm sorry. Are communities going to be able to hire you for this assistance, or how does that work? Because I know they're going to ask me, is the regional council going to be helping us with this?
I will let Jerry take that one.
Well, that's kind of up to the communities themselves. Typically, there's grant administration fees in there
Right.
to hire us. to administer the application from start to finish. And there is a set fee for that that's established through CDBG. We can have that paid by the communities for a cash match contribution in the application, or it can come out of the grant funds. So,
Okay.
but yes, that's up to the communities whether they want to hire us. If the communities are current for the past, I want to say 2 years on paying their assessments or dues to the regional council, then there's no requirement to advertise in a newspaper or solicit all the grant administrators that come on a list. They can just automatically hire us as long as they're current the last 2 years on paying their dues to us.
Okay, so that is what I'm going to stress, and that's what I'm going to recommend when I talk to these communities, that they first check on their dues and then make sure that they hire you all to help with this process. Because
Yeah, that's once it's funded. Yes.
okay,
Okay. Yeah.
The
Great question.
application, the application portion, because as Jerry said, that's once it's funded.
Yeah.
But typically, Jerry, with our communities, correct, is because they pay those dues, that
Yes,
our application preparation is free. It's covered in those
Mhm.
dues.
it's part of their dues that they pay us, that we will assist them with the application.
And so Marcus, if you're out meeting with your communities, or if anyone who is representing a specific community denied or a county level organization, and you have a community that is interested in the process, just let Jerry and I know, and we're more than welcome to come, or willing to come to council meetings
Okay.
as well.
I have a meeting set tomorrow in Mound City, so I'm going to bring that up. And
Okay. And just keep in mind that, Mound City does currently have a CDBG open.
they
We
do.
can work on it up front.
Okay,
And of course, the cycle's not been announced that it's open yet, but hopefully we can have this application closed by the time they announce those
sure.
grants. So
There's a lot of work to do. Yeah, there's
yeah,
with mapping
Yeah.
and identifying things and
Mhm.
verifying.
but I really truly think Mound City probably has some of these things done already.
Good.
But if anything, they may want to go back and look at it and make sure that, their ordinances are okay. And I
Okay.
believe they probably have a code enforcer or somebody already, since they have their own department there. So,
What will most communities know if they've paid their dues?
well, they should, but if no.
Okay, very good. That's what I'm going to recommend.
Okay, that's good.
That they get on board with that. So thank
Okay.
you.
Any other questions? All right.
Hey, Kim.
Yep.
Yeah, I have one. So I know that Grant City has one open, but
Well, hopefully soon, yes.
Hopefully,
yes,
yeah.
hopefully soon.
Mhm.
Which that could drag on for a while, that one.
Yeah.
So is this something that the county could apply for?
On this, no, the city actually would have to do it.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jerry, do you
Mhm.
think, because they do have a progress association there, could it be something the progress association applied for?
We would definitely have to ask that question to make sure.
So that might be a way to look, Megan, and see, but definitely you guys want to start through the beginning parts of this process while we're working on your wastewater system.
Yeah, it would have to be the city on behalf of the progress.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So now we're just going to talk a little bit about scoring, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And so we're going to have to show the need and impact And so you get points for the number of units proposed compared to the total dilapidated units, both occupied and vacant. And then you also get points for the number of units that you propose to demolish compared to the total number of vacant dilapidated units. And this kind of goes back to that 80% impact ratio that they are looking for at CDBG. And then they want to make sure that you have code enforcement, and you get points awarded for that. You also get points awarded for your map that identifies all your dilapidated structures and all your proposed structures that you would like to demolish. You get points for leveraging, and you get more points if your housing, your residential owners paid the full $1,000. But you can do, again, a split potentially between the city and the residential owners at $500 each. And then there is some in-kind match that you could potentially propose as part of the demolition. And then for any commercial properties that you are going to ask to demolish as part of your grant, you need to have a commitment of 20% of the demolition cost, and that's all in writing. So having all that documentation actually gives you points on your application and in your scoring. And then having your strategy written out and have interest of the property owners. So making sure that you have all those consent forms for all the projects that you are requesting to be part of the project is important. And then your project readiness, we get points for that as well. So making sure that you have not only all those consent and pledge forms signed, but you also have gone through the procurement process for your inspectors and construction crews and waste cleanup that you need for that part of the project. And then we also get points based on the size or cost per unit and hazardous waste that we're removing and cost effectiveness. And so that goes back to some of those coding in that Form F that we talked and showed earlier. And that's kind of it in terms of the workshop we had planned for this evening. Are there any more questions?
Hey, Kim, I have a question.
Go for it, Amy.
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking through some of Marcus's questions. So if he has, for example, 3 communities that want to do demo projects, they're competing against each other then?
Potentially, yes. If they all make the same CDBG application round. Jerry, do we usually find out? I feel like we usually find out how much money is available per category once the application comes out.
Yes, once CDBG knows what their allocation is, then they break that down into their categories, and then they can let us know how much is available for the state of Missouri.
But it is possible to get multiple projects funded from the same area. We've had bridge projects, multiple bridge projects funded at the same time in the same round of. So it just depends on who all applies and how strong everybody's application is and how much money is available.
Yeah, they're trying to get their cycles back on track. You know, really probably, I would think demolition should have been probably due in May or June, but they're so far behind with COVID and all the other types of grant applications or categories that have come out. But hopefully by next year, they'll get back on track. And then we'll know each year when they're due, so.
Are any of these grants tied to or contingent with like your downtown Main Street projects or programs or?
So I believe Main Street has some of its own, but that could be potentially some of the leveraging that you could look at. And as I said earlier, these would all be good steps, no matter what type of grant source you're going after, to have a community plan put together with showing that you've got code enforcement, that you've got ordinances in place, that you're able to show the history of properties and violations, that you've, working with property owners and getting their permission to participate, all of those steps, and having an idea of what your goals are as a community in terms of, are you wanting to do infill housing where you're taking down some of these older structures? Are you looking at doing a community park? Are you looking at, if it's a commercial structure, a new business there or a pocket park? Those types of things, and having that information now are standard across kind of any grant application you're going to want to do. We even have some local private foundations that might be interested in some of these types of projects, whether it be as match funds or if you just wanted to do a couple of small houses, they might be willing to help chip in if they know that it's going to help better the community.
Tabitha had a question there, and I was wondering the same thing. Is there any way around the consent of the property owner, various violations of codes, no attempt to rectify? So if the city has a condemned, you have a property that is truly dangerous. Kids are getting in there, people's been hurt, whatever the situation, can if it's condemned, can you move forward without the,
I believe that might be a recourse, but that is something that communities tend not to do lightly. And by that, I mean that many communities that I know of, that I've heard talk about that is kind of the ultimate last resort. I mean, even if they're looking at a project which could benefit the community going right back on that property, that is always kind of one of those things. Even like eminent domain and condemnation are kind of some of those things that we just, as a general rule or society, don't like. So they are something that communities, think really hard about. But that may be a recourse, and that again would be something I would talk to your city attorney about. But that might be an option. Any other questions? Jerry, any final thoughts?
Just again, we will send out packets in the slide to this tonight. And then we'll try, and I've got 4 different questions here that were asked tonight. And so we'll confirm on those with CDBG just to make sure that, we get those questions answered for y'all. And so, yeah, that'll be coming in as an email to you soon.
All right, well, thank you all for your attendance tonight.
So if you have questions, just email us.